All right, just a little bit of a preamble here before today's lesson. Now, today we're talking about visual language and visual patterns. These are two topics that are my favorite things to talk about when it comes to photography. And these ideas are absolutely critical when it comes to photography, and they're a key component to what makes you a good photographer. They are so important, in fact, that I've made an entire playlist on my YouTube channel completely free of charge for everyone to watch. So rather than repeating absolutely everything that is on there and wasting your time and your money regurgitating content here, I highly recommend that you go and watch that entire series as fast as you can because it will provide you with such a fantastic foundation for the rest of your photography journey. And in fact, that's going to be today's assignment to dive into that playlist because it's going to be very, very important moving forward, not only in this course, but for the rest of your journey. I will, however, give an outline of a few of the important basics for you photographers who haven't yet watched it, or you photographers who have watched it and need a little bit of a refresher. But hey, if you've already watched that entire playlist, then this kind of stuff is worth watching over and over again because, yeah, it is that important. All right, but first, let's start off with some definitions and then we will go into a few examples. So, visual language is how we communicate and express ourselves, not only through photography, but through any visual medium. Across photography, we have a very distinct set of visual language to use, and in other visual mediums, there are other sets of visual language to use as well. Either way, we are all speaking the same visual language. Now, it's a language because much like how spoken language is formed by combining words together and forming sentences and then paragraphs and creating larger forms of meaning, visual language does the same thing by what I like to call visual patterns. You can think of visual patterns like words in a paragraph. Each word has a particular meaning. Sometimes it has more than one meaning for a single word, but when multiple words are put together, they form sentences. And the sentence often has more implied meaning than the sum of its parts. The sentence is able to say more than a single word. From there, multiple sentences form paragraphs, which carry even more meaning, and then multiple paragraphs form stories, and then so on and so forth. When we think about the building blocks of visual language, the words, we think about visual patterns. Visual patterns are particular arrangements that occur within our compositions, whether consciously and with intention, or unconsciously and by chance. Now, the most successful artists are the photographers who can always communicate with intention. And this is what I want to teach you. Now, visual patterns are patterns for a reason. The word pattern implies that these things repeat. And they most certainly do in the world, and you can use them over and over. But they're also patterns because they have a very particular structure, and that structure has implied meaning. And that meaning is what we're expressing every single time that we are using a pattern. So, for example, in color and color theory, we have what's called complementary colors. It's this idea that there are specific colors that, when placed together, often look very appealing, as if they complement each other. However, the pattern with complementary colors is that the colors are actually opposites of each other on the color wheel. Yes, the opposite colors are complementary colors. This is the pattern. So in this example, blue and orange is perhaps the most famous complementary color combination of all time, as it's found in nature. Think of every sunrise and every sunset that you've seen. That's where you'll find them the most in nature. Another example is during the Christmas time when there's a lot of red and green. Again, they're the opposite side of the color wheel, meaning that they're complementary colors and they go well together visually. However, what happens when you mix blue and green together? Well, they aren't on the opposite side of the wheel from each other, and therefore they are not complementary colors, and they would not look as good together as, say, blue and orange might, right? If you're trying to use this as a complementary color pattern, then you've broken the pattern. And this idea is important because there are many, many visual patterns out there, all with their own implied meaning. Some of them are things like frames and space, leading lines, contrast, juxtaposition, visual hierarchy, scale, and so much more. And all of these visual patterns have to be constructed in a certain way, and they all have very particular meanings when constructed successfully. But when they are broken, or not constructed in the way that they're supposed to be, then they don't express the meaning the original pattern was trying to express. They don't say the words that you think they're saying, and therefore they don't form the paragraphs or the stories when you break them. It's like when you make a spelling mistake, but you've made so many that the entire paragraph is almost incomprehensible. Sure, you can kind of make out what's going on and what the point is, but it's nowhere near as articulate or effective or as easy to understand. Now, this is in stark contrast to how many photographers have been traditionally taught to learn photography through the years, through the idea of photography rules. It's because many of them were never taught photography from the perspective of the more holistic genre of visual art, which is where my background comes from. Now, I highly discourage you to think of photography rules as you may have heard them before, if you've heard the term before, because the idea of rules leads many to believe that if they were to break them, that they were, suddenly geniuses or somehow being avant-garde or unorthodox or cool, when in actual fact, it's just ignorance or delusion more than anything else. Patterns, when constructed properly, have implied meaning. Please remember this. And so when they're broken, they no longer have the meaning that they were originally constructed to have. I see a lot of beginners make this mistake. Rather than break these patterns or the rules, the idea is actually completely the opposite. Much like spoken word, the idea is to form sentences, and we do this by combining words together. In the same vein, in visual language, the aim of the game is to combine visual patterns together in order to express a message that is more than the sum of their parts, not to break their meaning. Now, once you start to amass a lexicon of these patterns, a vocabulary, right, you'll be able to see for yourself in other people's photographs which photographers actually understand what they're doing and are consciously doing it, rather than the ones who are just guessing and just using intuition. When you have a lexicon of your own, when you have a vocabulary of your own, you're able to then start to analyze other people's photographs and try to answer why they've used what they've used and their thought process behind it. And then you'll be able to start to discover and learn your own patterns as well. And over time, what you'll find is that when you've amassed the skill of many visual patterns and you've experimented with a lot of them, you'll find that you actually start to gravitate towards some patterns more than others, especially for the types of photography that you like to do. And keep a conscious eye on this, because this is the genesis of your style. And we will talk about style more in the days to come. But okay, let's talk about some actual visual patterns and give some examples so that you know what we're talking about here. So again, many of these are covered in depth over on my YouTube channel for free. So I really, really recommend watching all of those videos for a deeper dive. Let's start with frames, which is perhaps one of the easiest visual patterns to see with the highest amount of return for your time invested in this skill. And once you start seeing the world in frames, you don't really unsee it. I'm just warning you now. Now, frames are when your subject or an element in your composition is positioned or encapsulated between surrounding elements. Usually, doing this provides more direction to the scene as it enables you to focus down the subject. This is literally you saying to the viewer, hey, this thing between these things is important to look at. It's reducing the amount of elements in a composition and shifting those elements within the composition so that you can provide the viewer with an idea of what the most important thing is to be looking at. This idea is the general base principle of visual hierarchy, which we will talk about tomorrow. Now, frames don't necessarily need to be in squares or in circles, although hard shapes do tend to work a lot better because they're quite literal. But frames can also be two large elements or even one element, so long as the subject is encapsulated in some way in your composition, then you have a frame. Now, sometimes you might have frames within frames, or sometimes you might have frames within frames within frames. In reality, every single doorway you step into is a frame in and of itself. Every hallway you go down is a frame. Every time you see someone driving a car and, their head is in a frame when you're looking at them. The device you're watching this lesson on right now is framing my head. Frames are literally everywhere. And once you start to get a good idea of what a frame is, your eyes will never be the same again. Don't say I didn't warn you. Negative space is perhaps my favorite visual pattern out of all of them. And I'm always consciously using negative space and thinking about negative space the most when I'm taking photographs. Negative space is the deliberate inclusion of nothing. It's including empty space for the purpose of contrasting filled space. Negative space doesn't occupy any importance in and of itself. Rather, it has the purpose of directing the viewer to look at and identify the importance of what the filled space or the positive space does in the composition. What good negative space does is that it gives room for the positive space to assert itself. When you use negative space successfully, you're showing the viewer just how much of the composition is not something that actually matters, in contrast to how much space in your composition the subject or the positive space might actually have. Again, this establishes a visual hierarchy. Negative space is deliberately including things that are not important to the scene so that things that are important in the scene can become much more obvious and have a higher place up and higher visual importance. When it comes to contrast, there are actually 3 different types of contrast that I talk about. The first of which is tonal contrast, which is probably the most approachable contrast and easiest to understand. It is the difference between the brightest portions of the image and the darkest portions of the image in the same scene. It is a contrast in tone. And typically in photography, this is what most people think about or talk about when you say the word contrast. However, we also could be talking about color contrast, because color is a great way to show difference, which is what contrast actually is in an image. Contrast is difference. And especially using complementary or opposite colors such as blue and orange, we can use these colors to help the viewers of our images understand what is important in our images, or we can use it to add visual interest in our images as well. And then finally, we have what I call conceptual contrast or juxtaposition. And this is a far more abstract idea where elements within our compositions create some kind of difference. So we can think of this like in terms of abstract concepts such as old versus new, hard versus soft, nature versus urban, and so on. Now, this is much harder to do in our images, but when it works, conceptual contrast can really boost the meaning and the value applied to our images. Scale is almost undoubtedly something that you've either used or seen before in photography. A very common example of scale is a little person in a big landscape. Scale is amazing to use as a visual pattern because it provides a sense of awe and wonder and epicness. And because the emotions that surround those feelings are so strong and so ubiquitous, we see scale used all the time by photographers across the globe. Now, scale is basically broken down into 2 parts: the reference point and whatever it is that is the large object. The reference point is the element within our composition that allows us to understand the base size or the base scale of the second part, the actual large object itself. And it's this contrast between the reference point and the object in terms of their size which allows for the understanding of scale. The greater the contrast in size, the greater the sense of scale. A great reference point that is commonly used is a human. Humans are fantastic reference points because all of us generally understand how large other humans are. And this gives us an inherent understanding of the general shape and the general height of the reference point. And this is why we see so many images of tiny people in a gigantic landscape, because we understand just how big or how small humans can be. And the relativity and the proportion of the human in the frame gives us an understanding of just how large the overall context is. In many occasions in our photography, we'll come across leading lines. These are big, obvious lines that occur in our compositions that most of the time lead our viewers' eyes into a subject or a place of interest that the photographer wants you to look to. Leading lines are about movement. They're about creating a place for your viewers' eyes to rest and to be initially drawn to, and then providing them a directive to move their eyes from one place to another. It's about creating dynamic images that force the viewers around your composition and make them discover more of it more and more, and doing so makes the image inherently have more visual interest. Leading lines can occur all over the natural world, but the places they tend to come up quite often is in places where there are straight roads or corridors or hallways, and these are called vanishing points. And these lines are created by distance and perspective, and in conjunction with the horizon in many occasions, they are an easy way to get started adding them to your lexicon. Every time you see a street or a hallway, you can think vanishing point. Now, leading lines can also be simple things in your composition as well. They can be the branches of a tree leading your viewer's eye into a subject, like this example. You could also use a horizon line to lead into a subject as well, like in this example. There are many creative ways of how to use leading lines. Think about how you can creatively incorporate the things in your environment to draw your viewer's eyes to a potential area of interest that you want them to look. This is a visual pattern that isn't specifically its own pattern per se. It's more aligned with the idea of tonal contrast, but shadow is a very easy pattern to get started with and easy to see results with instantly. Shadow is the absence of light, and it's a pattern much like frames where when you train yourself to see it, your eyes will never be the same again, which is why I'm calling it out as a separate pattern, because it is this easy to approach and it has a really big return on time invested in learning in it. The quality of shadow is a big thing here. As an exercise, try to notice the shadows cast by objects wherever you are. You'll notice that there's a specific quality of shadow that is different every single time wherever you are. Sometimes these shadows are soft, sometimes they are hard, sometimes they're light, sometimes they're dark. In all of these different occasions, the intensity and the quality of light is different. So pay attention to what kind of light ends up throwing that shadow. Something that's very easy to get started with is hard shadow or hard light. And this is very high contrast. It's a very high contrast style of photography where the absence of light is just as important as the light itself. With exposure in general, our eyes as humans are drawn to the brightest portions of the image first, and highlights demand attention. And in many ways, it is the shadow that provides the shaping of the hard light, and without it, the light spills everywhere and goes out of control. So try to spot and understand shadow as a visual pattern, because shadows are a key to understanding light. So the visual pattern of patterns is all about the repetition of an element. You can have quite literal patterns in what most might perceive as patterns, like in a texture or a fabric or something like that. But patterns also occur out in the natural world as well. Think about windows on a building, or the shape that birds make when they fly together in a V. Whenever the same thing occurs more than once, it is a pattern. Now, this also applies to the idea of number as well. For example, when you're shooting images with multiples of the same element, odd numbers can really help add visual interest. So shooting 3s of that thing, or shooting 5s of that thing, or shooting 8 of that thing. Sometimes we can also use symmetry as a pattern too. When things are repeated on both sides of an element, we can also call this a pattern. Oftentimes, you see something that is uniform and settled like a pattern, and breaking that pattern in some small way often causes a little mental disrupt and therefore demands your attention. And this technique can be quite useful for increasing the amount of visual interest in your scene. Now, there are so many more visual patterns and ideas to explore here when it comes to visual language. And again, the idea is to learn as many patterns as possible and then become skillful at combining them all together. This is photographing with intention. And when we photograph with intention, we're deliberately visually communicating. And that makes what we make well on its way to being called art. So the assignment is, as I mentioned at the start of the lesson, to go and check out my playlist to go further in depth with even more patterns if you can after this lesson. I would recommend watching at least one a day until you've finished all 10 of the videos. All right, I'll see you tomorrow.